Hey guys, welcome to lesson 3 of learning Japanese. Today we are going to cover pronoun usage in the Japanese language. And to do that, first and foremost, what we need to do is discuss how pronouns are, well, generally used in the Japanese language. So I'm sure you guys are pretty tired of hearing this, but again, Japanese is a lot different from many other languages and probably a majority of languages that most people know. And when we're talking about that in the sense of pronoun usage, the reason behind that is because generally in the Japanese language, pronouns aren't required. In Japanese, there isn't necessarily a grammatical requirement to have a subject in a sentence. Unsurprisingly, this absence of a requirement stretches into what we know as the necessity of, say, first person, second person, and third person pronouns when referring to yourself, the person you're talking to, or other people or persons. That being said, you might be surprised when you find out that even though that is true, in Japanese, there are a plethora of first person, second person, and third person pronouns, and it's actually really quite interesting and fun to mix up your usages of them depending on the context of the situation or how you're feeling or your relationship with the persons that you're talking to. So in English, we have these, say, 3 personal pronouns that we generally widespread use. And those, of course, are I, you, and they. We can count, I guess, like me in that too, but even so, that's 4, less than 5. And what I'm going to cover in this video are more than 15 Japanese pronouns that are used depending on first person, second person, and etc. What we need to know before doing that, though, is that in Japanese, even though the pronouns are abundant, unlike English, they actually can represent more than the meaning of just referring to yourself or another person or the person you're directly talking to. For example, we have probably the most common Japanese first-person pronoun, Watashi. Watashi means I most commonly, but it can also be used to mean personal or private. Furthermore, we have the word Boku, which is a first-person pronoun that primarily males use to refer themselves. But what you might not know is that it also has the definition of meaning quite literally manservant. And although these are 2 different denotations for the word, they're actually pretty closely related, as you'll find out later when I talk about the context of using the Boku first-person pronoun. And that's just a tidbit of how kind of intriguing it is how things are interconnected historically and transcending that history into the grammatical system infrastructure of the language. Another little prerequisite knowledge to know before we delve into the actual pronouns is that, as I aforementioned, there isn't a requirement to have a subject in sentences for the Japanese language, because in the Japanese language there are nuances that make it more often than not pretty obvious who or what you're talking about, even though you don't say their name or a pronoun to associate them. And this is so true that it can sometimes seem formal and sometimes even rude or impolite when you do use them. So it's kind of strange and maybe even nerve-wracking to new speakers that a simple mishap in your words by using a pronoun can make you seem just as formal as it can make you seem rude, because they're basically complete opposites. So yeah. Personally, I like to think of them as subtle implicities, because in English there are actually some scenarios that could be related to the way that Japanese speakers speak like this. Say in a very informal situation where your very close friend asks you where somebody else is, and you say very abridged like and informally, "Oh, out to get lunch," or something like that. But say you're a shoddy intern at this really classy business and your boss asks you where the other intern is. I think it's safe to bet that you won't give him the same response that you gave to your close chum. You might say something more informative and formal like, "Oh, I believe he went out to get lunch." And I don't know, maybe you'll even add like a sir at the end. So what we're gonna go over first is, of course, the more common first person pronouns. In other words, how to say I in Japanese. So a quick note of instruction on how to pluralize the pronouns that I'm about to mention. The go-to method is basically to add the suffix tachi at the end of them to symbolize their plural form. But there are some pronouns that have a particular case in which that won't apply, and I'll mention them if I know them off the top of my head, but for the most part, you're safe with just using tachi with the ones that you'll learn. First up, we have the word watashi, and in a formal or polite context, this pronoun is gender neutral in that boys and girls can use it safely without being considered adversely feminine or masculine. But in informal and casual context, this pronoun is more commonly interpreted as a feminine pronoun to use. Personally, it's one of my favorite first person pronouns just because I like the auditory ring that it has to it, but yeah, those are the standards. Next, we have watakushi, which uses the same kanji as watashi actually, but is considered way more formal, like I'm talking super formal. To my understanding, this is the most polite form that you can use when referring to yourself. Next, we have the word ware, which is another formal first person pronoun, but it can also be used as a second person pronoun. And when you are using it so, it's usually to imply that the person you're speaking to is rather rude. Next, we have waga, which in its context means more of a my or our instead of I, me, or we. And it's used in formalities or speeches to kind of trigger a unity amongst your group. Next, we have ore, which is pretty informal and it's mostly used by males. When it's used, its context usually suggests a masculinity within the speaker that he's trying to express, or in the context where he is speaking towards a group that is younger than him or of lesser status. So it kind of subtly, or not so subtly, hints at that superiority that the speaker has over his addressees. But when this word is used amongst family or pretty close friends, it can imply familiarity instead of superiority. Next, we have the word boku, which is informal as well, and it's again mostly used by males, and at times it can also have a different tone to it. Like I said earlier, it has the definition manservant to it, so you can kind of understand how that derives from the meaning. Next, we move on to the more feminine pronouns, and we have Atashi, which is informal and again used by females mostly. This one is rarely seen in writing at all. It's very conversational pronoun. And the kind of nuance that it's adapted over the times is that it's kind of a cute way to refer to yourself. Next, we have uchi, which is also a word that means house, but in this context, it means more of one's own. And this is an informal pronoun, and it's used more so by females, but when it's used in the context of referring to your own household in the sense that you're talking about your pets or your family members, it's gender neutral. Its plural form is different from the others in which you kind of just attach tachi to the end of them, like watashi tachi or anata tachi. This one is uchida, and when you use the plural, that is also gender neutral. Next, we have basically your own name. In English, there's kind of a gimmick in that instead of using I to refer to yourself, some characters will refer to themselves in the third person to either make themselves seem important or just give off the feeling of being a self-important asshole. But in Japanese, when this occurs, it's usually a kind of cute informal thing that children use, and I guess the image behind it is that they're kind of too young to know all of the pronouns, and they kind of represent that innocent figure that lives in its own world.